Thank you very much for having me, and I'm very sorry that I cannot join you in person due to my health issues. So I hope you are having a good time, and I will do my best to give you some insight into the Czech theater after 1989. Okay, so I hope everything's working. Um, First of all, I would like to share some presentation with you. So I'm going to start. I will share my screen in just a second. So the title of my paper is The Political versus Laughter in the Czech Post-1989 Theater. And in my presentation, I will focus on the interrelation between the political and the comic in a kind of theater that relates to the concept of post-dramatic theater. I have been dealing with this issue within my long-term research project called Redefining the Agency Post-1989 Crisis in the Czech and former East German Theater, conducted first at the Freie Universität Berlin and now at the Prague Theater Faculty. In this research, I have examined transformation of the social function of Czech and former East German theater in the early 1990s. And I have paid a particular attention to the issue of how the political was performed on stage in both countries. When using the term of the political, I refer to a specific concept. It's a concept by the political philosopher Chantal Mouffe, and she defines the political as, quote, the expression of a particular structure of power relations, while she understands politics as a set, quote, as a set of practices and institutions through which the order is created, organizing human coexistence in the context of conflictuality provided by the political, end quote. When exploring how the political was performed on stage in the Czech context, one realizes that according to the currently prevalent historiographical narrative, the situation of Czech theater changed dramatically in the years following the so-called Velvet Revolution in 1989. Faced with financial difficulties and declining audience numbers, theater is said to have abandoned its interest in social and political issues. Czech theater is therefore commonly said to have suffered a crisis and to have largely lost its political clout. Historians claim that the early 1990s theater gravitated towards a more lucrative, entertaining repertory and dramaturgy of private issues, often staged within the framework of the so-called postmodernist aesthetics. According to this version of events, post-1989 Czech theater alienated itself from public affairs and forfeited its former capacity for shaping broader social discourses. Drawing on the findings of my up-to-now research, I argue that in the early 1990s, the political, rather than disappearing from Czech stages, was in fact redefined. However, social criticism contained in the productions may not have always resonated within the auditorium for several reasons. One of them could be the comic dimension of the performance, which in some cases undermine the political one. Since I can hear some voices, I will just check that everything is fine. Is it? I hope so. Okay, so I continue. In the following case study, I will analyze the interrelation of the political and the comic in a postmodernist, so-called postmodernist, Czech production titled Naši furianti. In English, it's called Our Swaggerers. I'm not sure that you are familiar with the term swaggerers. Swaggerer is someone who is proud, who is very self-confident and selfish also. Okay. Okay. This production was directed by an outstanding Czech theater director of the 1990s, Petr Lebl. And the play premiered in 1994 at the Theatre on the Balustrade in Prague. In the Czech discourse on theatre, the term postmodernism has been employed rather casually since the late 1980s. It has generally been associated with genre blending, formal experimentation, emphasis on style and metaphor, and deconstruction of both the plot and the coherent interpretation of a production. As for the comic aspect, irony, playfulness, and parody have often been listed among the features of postmodern theatre. Typically, the Czech theatre ensembles that were labeled as postmodernist before 1989 did not explicitly address political issues on stage, due in part to the continued existence of censorship. Therefore, this up-and-coming aesthetic acquired a reputation for being apolitical and stayed on well into the 1990s, when postmodernist theatre became a leading trend at glance. A number of features of Czech postmodern theatre aesthetics seem largely to match the attributes of post-dramatic theatre, as famously described by Hans-Thies Lehmann in 1999. As for Lehmann's approach to the comedy-like aspect of post-dramatic productions, it did not stand in the center of his attention in his monograph, Post-Dramatic Theatre. Still, Lehmann listed a cool fun theatre genre among the examples of post-dramatic theatre, referring to the work of such ensembles as Gob Squad and Shishi Pop, which have been mixed with the principles of parody, intertextuality, pop culture, irony, cynicism, wordplay, and media. Mentioning the projects of Christopher Schlingensief and Castorf's era in Volksbühne Berlin, Lehmann also insinuated a political potential of the cool fun theatre. However, generally speaking, Lehmann elaborated on the relation between post-dramatic and the political rather marginally in his monograph. In more depth, Lehmann handled the issue in the 2000s, focusing specifically on the genre of tragedy, not comedy. According to my current knowledge, the interrelation between post-dramatic theatre, the political, and the comic has so far been little studied academically. The same applies to the question of the relationship between comedy and post-dramatic theatre, an exception being the study of the nature of a character in post-dramatic comedy by the Slovenian scholar Jure Gantar. As for the connection of the political and comical aspect in Czech theatre shortly after the so-called Velvet Revolution, a handful of newly written plays dealt with both of them, intending to engage in a dialogue with the broader public. Some of these plays reflected on the recently concluded communist era, others commented on the condition of Czech society as it was undergoing the political and economic transition. Let me mention one particular example, if everything works. Okay, so this is the theater where Leibelt performed the production I'm talking about. And this is the production I wanted to mention. So Karel Steigerwald's play Noble, premiered 1994, satirizing the rapacious Czech capitalism of the 1990s, is perhaps the most prototypical example of this trend. However, such plays largely failed to attract much attention among either the audiences or the critics. According to the historian Libor Vodička, Czech theatre audiences lacked interest in political satire, since such plays gave, quote, a satirical dressing down to a completely unconvincing and vapid representation of the world. Moreover, the historian was skeptical about all emerging plays which dealt with the political. He argued that, quote, the mixed results delivered by virtually all the productions that reflected on the recent past helped to perpetuate the widely shared notion that political topics were ill-suited for today's theater, end quote. Before we take a closer look at Label's approach to staging the political, let me briefly introduce his aesthetics. One could easily point out a number of attributes listed by Lehmann in post-dramatic theater, especially visual dramaturgy, non-hierarchy, simultaneity, semantic density, plethora, musicalization, and physicality. In contrast to most so-called post-dramatic directors, however, Label did not deconstruct the playtext. On the contrary, drawing on a meticulously close reading, he typically developed numerous playful, often intertextual associations and allusions. Also, for this reason, we can hardly compare Label's style with profound theater as conceptualized by Lehmann. Unlike the ensembles such as Gob Squad or Shishi Pop, listed by the theorists, Label's aesthetics was much more theatrical and stylized, less Brechtian, and it did not include live cinema or other usage of the media. Now you can see Petr Label himself. Label's work has been theorized by several Czech theater scholars, but the political aspect of his work, as well as the comic one, have mostly been overlooked. Looking closely at the archival sources, however, one realizes that Label openly declared his stance concerning the relationship between theater and the political in the early 1990s. In an interview, he said, quote, "When a person proclaims they're doing political theater, it's as if they said they were doing a blue color," end quote. This confirms that he indeed regarded the political dimension an integral part of theater, even if his work has rarely been perceived in this way. Arguably, his production of Our Auswegerus reveals his standpoint more clearly than his other productions. Label's decision to stage Auswegerus reflected the socio-political climate of the early 1990s. Apparently, he conceived the intention to stage the play in the early 1993, immediately after the division of Czechoslovakia and establishment of an independent Czech Republic. Label settled on a canonical 19th century play written by Ladislav Strupežnický in a realist style and premiered at the National Theatre in Prague in 1887. Set in a 19th century Czech village, the plot revolves around a dispute over the election of a new night watchman. The play satirized Czech society, especially Czech villagers, and emphasized their stubbornness, narrow-mindedness, and pride. In the playbill, I should also show you, this is the National Theatre in Prague, where this play was premiered in the 19th century. And this is the playbill. And in this playbill, Petr Label prefaced his introduction by quoting the first president of Czechoslovakia, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, who exhorted the Czechs to recognize and mend their flaws, to do away with the, quote, lingering small-mindedness plaguing our life as a nation, end quote. Collaborating with the playwright Lenka Lagronová, Label adopted the original playtext, directed the production, and also designed the set. In his production, he followed and amplified Strupežnický's sarcastic view of the Czech identity, added topic references to current social and political issues. The adaptation also underscored the immorality of the rural community, while in the 19th century play, the head of the village council shoots a hare, the animal. In Label's production, he accidentally shoots a man called Hare, and the community decides to conceal the murder from police investigators. Thus, the villagers became accessories to a capital crime, and sharing this secret and guilt further strengthens their communal bonds. What might be implied here is an analogy between the perverted loyalty of the village community on stage and the corruption and criminal practices that accompanied the transformative social processes of the 1990s, particularly with respect to the privatization of state property. When directing the production, Leibel employed a number of aesthetic strategies related to the comic. One of the critics who reviewed the production, Zdeněk Hořínek, identified following principles, which he linked with postmodernism: intertextual correspondence, quotation, irony, hyperbole, blasphemy, and parody. Therefore, it is obvious that the political was intensely interwoven with the comic on stage. For instance, Leibel deconstructed myths about Czech greatness by ironizing several commonplace emblems of Czech national mythology, such as the legend of the Blaník Knights. They represented an army of warriors resting in the mountain of Blaník, who are always ready to ride out and save the Czech nation should it come under threat. In Leibel's production, one of the main characters, who you can see at the picture, the military veteran Blaha, represented one of the Blaník Knights. Clad in heavy medieval armor, he embodied a purely clumsy and anachronistic figure whose comicalness was compounded by numerous physical extempore. Moreover, the director challenged the image of Czech society as nationally and rationally homogeneous. He emphasized the Jewishness of the characters of the innkeeper and his wife, who even performed the Czech national anthem on stage, again with the comic or rather tragicomic overtones, since the publican played the melody on beer mugs. Leibel also added German lines to the part of one of the lead characters, hinting at pre-1945 German population of the Czech lands. The staging also broached the subject of race. Leibel cast a Guinea-Bissau-born black actor in a minor role of village teacher, raising the issue of racial plurality and also the issue of Czechs' relation to otherness and foreignness. At the time, xenophobia was hardly a rare occurrence, due in part to the country's 40-year isolation from the more ethnically diverse Western countries. In 1999, the Czech sociologist Jiřina Šiklová commented on the condition of Czech 1990s society in a way that largely corresponded to the issues Leibel performed in his production of Our Swaggers. Let me quote her. Whether we want to or not, we Czech will have to get used to living with people of different races, customs, and religions. Perhaps our fear of everything foreign is what makes us insist that the traditional relationship between men and women be maintained within the model of the family. In a way, our attitude is not so far from the attitudes of Islamic fundamentalists. Any group that feels threatened tends to hold together and emphasize its differentness with the help of various symbols. End quote. And it was precisely those symbols that received an ironical treatment in Leibel's production. In other words, it is beyond question that his production tackled important social issues of the day. In 1994, he was among the first theatre makers, if not the very first one, to put xenophobia on the public agenda. But to what extent was Leibel's innovative contribution to the public debate noticed by the public sphere? It is likely that Leibel's young audiences understood these efforts. However, when reading reviews of Our Swaggers, it is obvious that most reviewers either completely overlooked or attached little importance to the social and political poignancy of the production. The reviews were predominantly concerned with matters of aesthetic and the question whether Leibel's postmodern treatment was a good match for Stroupešnický's canonical material. The political elements were barely commented, and if so, such remarks were rather passing and vague. One of the rare characterization of the production's both political and comic dimensions was published by the critic Petr Pavlovsky. Quote, Leiber's production is full of grotesque, hurtful comicality, which hits its target like a carpet bombing. End quote. In other cases, remarks on the social critical layer of the production were offhand and superficial. Casting the black actor with foreign accent was only briefly commented on as an extravagant gesture or just a joke. Only occasionally did the reviewers see a reference to the phenomenon of guest work called Gasta. As for Leiber's emphasis of Jewishness of some characters, only one critic, Jana Machalická, linked his doing with criticism of xenophobia. However, she found the way he did it superficial, oversimplifying. Generally speaking, it is obvious that the reviewers did not give serious consideration to the social and political dimension of the issues at hand. Why was it so? And I'm slowly coming to the end of my presentation. Firstly, I would argue that most of the critics did not consider xenophobia and other criticism of the Czech national character and status quo major items of the public agenda. It is as if their enactment on stage slipped their attention, which may also be due to the fact that these issues were marginalized in the public debate at the time. Secondly, I would ascribe the omission to the reviewers' unfamiliarity with the traumatic treatment of the political as present in the production. During the communist era, the political in Czech theater was articulated in neat dichotomies, us versus them, while in Leiber's production, the political attained pluralistic, heterogeneous, and deconstructive qualities. Thirdly, and this is closely linked to my previous point, I believe that the critics were unable to process the political when performed in a post-dramatic aesthetic code, which was still relatively new to them, and hence not easy to decipher. As I have already mentioned, Leiber staged the political with a high degree of ambiguity, rendering it hard to translate into the language of the established political discourse. This ambiguity was even multiplied by the comic tone of most of the films, which often overshadowed the more serious layers of the piece. That was especially the case when a less experienced, typically country audience participated in the performance. For instance, to them, the character of the teacher played by a black actor did not refer to xenophobia, but represented a simple joke. Black man dressed in a Czech national costume was utterly funny to them, since such an image was a very unlikely phenomenon at the time. In such situations, laughter of the audience rather stultified the political edge of the performance. Unlike in a well-functioning satire, the comic did not enhance the social criticism of the piece. The audience's laughter became rather a celebration of the collective sharing of the given moment, and also of the less problematic version of reality and the Czech identity. The society as portrayed by Leiber was perceived by spectators as humorously foolish, rather than menacingly corrupt and depraved. The audience seemed to be captivated by the vitality of the community performed on stage. The vital force of the villagers was further multiplied by the fact that Leiber placed more than 30 characters, here you can see the cast, more than 30 characters of the play on the tiny stage of the theater on the balustrade. One critic who reviewed Leiber's production, Milan Lukáš, noted that, quote, a somewhat ritualized, almost barbaric collectivist solidarity, end quote, was performed on stage. I believe that this kind of atavistic sense for community and its bones probably overlapped from the stage to the auditorium. The critic Lukáš also found and appreciated the quality of just surviving and being alive in Leiber's performing the Czech community. Referring to the scenography of the production, which included a strange onion-like flower I hope you can see it now, which grew out of a tree stump. The critic summed up his view of the production's message in the following words. Quote, "We are tree stumps. Maybe we even stink a little at the world, but we are alive, thank God." End quote. Therefore, it seems that the comic dimension was heavily involved in creating a strong bond between the actors and the audience. The experience of theatre's liveness, presence, and togetherness generated pleasure in the spectators and weakened their ability to take a rational distance, which would apparently be necessary to stimulate rather unpleasant self-reflection. To conclude, despite the fact that the director label included a multi-layered social criticism in his production, the political dimension of Our Ars Vegaris was undermined by its comicality. Also, for other reasons I've already mentioned, the criticism did not resonate with the audiences. However, the production proves that despite the existing narrative of the 1990s theatre being apolitical, some representatives of so-called post-modernist theatre did handle political issues on stage, even if they were not always recognized and understood. Thank you very much.